Do you know that awkward moment when someone asks you, so when did Rome actually fall? And the correct answers are several. By the way, one of them isn't even about Rome itself, but about a city on the other side of the Mediterranean. Sounds strange? Let's sort it out without myths and without academic boredom. I promise it'll be simple, clear, and with examples you'll recognize from real life. And yes, halfway through we'll reach one emperor's decision that knocked discipline out of the army, with aftershocks for decades. To be direct, no one can point to a calendar and say, here Rome existed, and here it's gone. An empire that powerful couldn't disappear in a single day. The most common version says the fall of the Roman Empire is dated to September 4th, 476. That's the day the barbarian leader Odoacer deposed the last Western emperor and sent the imperial regalia east. Make sense? It does. But there's a nuance. That applied to the western half. The eastern half kept going and called itself the Roman Empire for many more centuries. Some will say 1453, the fall of Constantinople. That's also true in a different logic. And if you're even more careful, then after 476, some old Roman institutions still breathed here and there, and the Senate existed for a while. So it's more accurate to say Rome didn't collapse on a Thursday. It settled for a long time. Okay, so how did a rock-solid empire end up here at all? To understand that, let's rewind to the brightest moment. Rome had a period of almost ideal management weather, the end of the 1st and nearly all of the 2nd century. It's often called the era of the Five Good Emperors, and many historians consider it one of the best times to be alive on the planet. The rulers of the Antonine line were notably wise. Just picture a company where the leadership finally stops pulling the blanket to its side, makes peace with the so-called board, and starts promoting not just relatives, but genuinely capable people. That's roughly how Rome looked. Order in finances, peaceful years, a boom in infrastructure, expansion of borders, respect for the law. By the way, earlier one emperor carefully patched up the budget while hardly getting dragged into wars. His name was Vespasian, and his successors used that safety margin to the fullest. They added Assyria and Arabia, settled internal conflicts, and earned public support. This is probably the main story because that group of emperors had an interesting approach. For once, Rome stepped away from aristocratic habit, and key posts went to worthy people regardless of birth. For example, all these emperors adopted capable successors approved by the Senate and the army, so the job went to a professional, which of course helped the state. The core feature of that era wasn't magic, it was staffing. Worthy successors were chosen, essentially by merit rather than by blood. It sounds basic, but exactly those basic things give empires a second wind. But the last of the 5, Marcus Aurelius, broke the pattern by naming his own son, Commodus, as heir. The son turned out hot-headed, combative, and, to put it mildly, not very gifted at governing. He managed in just a few years to wreck almost everything gained over a century and was killed in the year 192, after which Rome sank into another round of power struggles. Familiar story, right? Imagine a corporation where for years leaders filled positions with qualified, responsible people, and then suddenly pick the next boss because he's our guy. Result, assassinations, a wave of instability, and emperors changing like coaches on a losing team. Each one arrives promising to bring greatness back. And a couple of years later, he's gone. Region after region starts living on its own. And right here, 2 big forces hit Rome at once. Sharp ideological shifts inside and the brutal logistics of a huge country with very different regions. Classical Rome meant a pantheon of gods, rituals, old cults. But a new movement grows: Christianity. At first it faced persecution, and emperors, including Diocletian, encouraged crackdowns. But that started to go too far. If in the 1st century the destruction of temples was a minor thing, by the 3rd it triggered serious uprisings. And after Emperor Constantine in 313 recognized Christianity and banned persecution, the pendulum swung the other way. Now pagans were pushed out, which obviously didn't help social peace. Let's be adults about it. The question isn't which religion is better. It's that any rapid rule change hits familiar institutions. It's like suddenly overhauling the tax code and the benefit system. Even if the idea is good in practice, there's going to be a wave of pushback. Another myth is that Rome was always one smooth slab. In reality, the empire was multilingual and multicultural from early on. The East spoke Greek, the West Latin, and that was fine. Emperors didn't force everyone to speak the same. A lot assimilated naturally. In the late 4th century, the state is formally split into West and East. It sounds dramatic, but in essence, it's an attempt to run a monster whose capital is thousands of miles from frontier garrisons. It's like running a business from New York while trying to hand-manage warehouses deep on another continent without the internet or modern comms.
Fucking shit.
By the way, a bit earlier, they even tried a tetrarchy. 4 large zones, 4 people in charge. Again, it was a practical workaround for governing huge lands. For example, sending an imperial decree from Rome to Constantinople over thousands of miles back then was nearly impossible. And since the throne often hosted rulers of questionable judgment, those decrees weren't exactly brilliant either. The point of splitting was simple: have someone on the spot to keep stability. But it turned out the real trouble, the reason for collapse, was that in the 4th to 5th centuries, that very stability evaporated. Now to what always hurts most: the wallet. When an empire stops expanding forever, war booty dries up, but expenses remain. Soldiers' pay gets delayed, taxes creep upward, and artisans and farmers find it harder to compete with big landowners. Bit by bit, Rome's middle class gets wiped out. Small craftsmen and landholders go bankrupt and get absorbed by the big players. And with the middle gone, the legendary single imperial market withers. Trade gasps for air, and the budget misses revenue not as a one-off, but systemically. This started back in the 3rd century crisis. By Constantine's time, after Christianity was recognized, people even talked about as many as 2 million monks. People entered the cloister willingly, you didn't have to work, and support money came out of citizens' pockets. For scale, the entire empire had roughly 55 million people then. Add the elite's habit of living large, and you get a snowball of obligations rolling downhill faster and faster. The climate dips a bit colder, epidemics hit, several disease waves mow down cities and garrisons. And that stokes a brutal demographic slide. Birth rates fall, not only among the poor, but among the comfortable classes who were used to leisure rather than war or hard work. According to different historians, the population rises and falls across centuries, but, for example, in 150 CE, there were about 65 million people, and by 400 CE, only about 50 million. That means fewer working hands to support monks, soldiers, and elites, and fewer men eager to join the legions for pay that's late and shrinking. Now guess who suffers first when people are scarce and land is huge? Exactly, and the army. In the fat years, men joined the legions gladly. Prestige, patriotism, solid pay, and land. But when pay is late and the tax burden grows, fewer want in. The empire starts recruiting on the frontiers. Federates. Neighboring fighters who serve for land and privileges. The idea itself isn't absurd. I grant land, you guard the border. But when discipline and loyalty get replaced by personal deals with local generals, that loyalty shifts. Not to the state, but to whoever is nearby and paying today. While the economy and politics crack inside, the folks Rome called barbarians don't vanish beyond the borders. Defending against them with a demoralized, shrunken army was unrealistic. So Rome tried to make friends. Emperor Theodosius I even allowed Goths to settle on Roman territory. For a while, they swore oaths to defend the land. For a while, they were hired as federates. In other words, barbarians, to guard the border from other barbarians. But all this led to the obvious outcome, and the barbarization of Rome. After the split into East and West, the western side had it rough. Germanic and other groups lined the borders, and by the early 5th century lived inside the empire as if at home. Some rulers still fought them off, and with Stilicho in 402 and 406 fairly well. But really there was barely an army left, and part of the legions already consisted of those same hired outsiders. As a result, in the early 5th century, the Goths under Alaric took Rome. Surprisingly, there was less savagery than we tend to imagine. It's remembered as one of the more restrained sackings, since the invaders were Christians and didn't commit special horrors against fellow believers. That didn't stop them from looting the capital. They mostly spared monuments, unless there was gold on them, which they took. In the first half of the 5th century, the empire still tried to hit back, but the Goths weren't the only ones. There were Huns, Angles, Saxons, and Attila bled both east and west. If Constantinople managed a shameful payoff,
shut up and take my money!
Rome faced several brutal attacks. A few decades later, in 455, came another sack, this time harsh. They even carried off the roof of Jupiter's Capitoline temple. Only Attila's sudden death gave the struggling empire a breather. And here it's very easy to say, well, that's it, the outsiders broke Rome. But no. Without internal failures, the enemy doesn't get in that deep. If Rome itself could be looted that easily, imagine the rest of the country. Out in the provinces, new kingdoms were set up with little pushback. At that pace, by 457, the Western Empire had been reduced largely to Italy. Majorian tried to claw back territory from 457 into the early 460s, retaking parts of Spain and Gaul, but was overthrown by the power broker Ricimer. After that came a string of short-lived rulers. In 476, the Germanic leader Odoacer made a symbolic move. He deposed Romulus Augustulus, the last Western Roman emperor, sent the imperial regalia east, and declared he would rule in his own name. That date is traditionally counted as the fall of the Western state, but as you've already seen, the story is badly simplified. In reality, Rome died earlier, and barbarian strongmen were plenty before Odoacer. The fall wasn't about a mid-level Germanic commander, it was about constantly changing emperors, rising taxes, a demographic crunch, and an elite totally out of touch. When the empire still had money and muscle, whole crowds lived off the public purse. Feeding everyone meant burning through huge resources. Under those conditions, the legendary legions couldn't stay the same. Their strength relied on discipline, loyalty, and shared purpose. Once the talent pipeline collapsed and pay got delayed, discipline cracked and loyalty evaporated. And what patriotism can you expect when more and more ranks were filled by mercenaries and outsiders? There's no mysticism in Rome's fall, only a chain of very down-to-earth causes. And today's Rome has almost nothing in common with the Rome that fell 15 centuries ago. Strictly speaking, the Roman state in the East, later called Byzantium, kept that identity for centuries, trying to hold on to its old power. In the West, Germanic peoples tried on Rome's legacy more than once and called it their own. Later, Europe even had the Holy Roman Empire, which Napoleon dissolved in 1806. Calling that the same ancient Rome is like saying modern London is literally the Celtic town it once replaced. The real Roman Empire didn't fall in a single day or for a single reason. It was a long, layered process. So if you get asked again, in what year did Rome fall? Answer confidently, depends on what you mean by Rome. And then add, the main lesson isn't the date, it's how empires come apart from the inside long before enemies reach the gates. That's real history. And by the way, it still speaks to us today. If this was helpful, consider subscribing. It really supports the channel. Thanks for watching.